I remember when I was trying to become a professional photographer, specifically when I was trying to get into weddings, I was always told that you had to have a full frame camera. And more than that, you had to have dual SD card slots. And at the time, I was in college, working a part-time job and attending classes, and I sat there thinking to myself, how the hell am I going to afford a $1,500 camera body and have to think about lenses as well just to be able to shoot weddings? That seems like a huge investment. And it took me years to actually make the jump to a full frame. And even when I did, I didn't shoot on dual SD cards. I shot a couple years of weddings with singular SD cards, just kind of taking the risk. And even now, that leap from crop sensor to full frame is a big jump, especially financially for a lot of people. Quite frankly, there's not a ton of very compelling, affordable full frame options that don't make you feel like you're giving up a lot of important features. So if you are someone that is in that same situation, you are looking to make the jump from APS-C to full frame, and you really want to go and get something with dual SD cards, something with the professional features that'll be able to last you a long time as a professional and meet all of those demands without breaking the bank, you might be a little bit discouraged to see what little options there are out there. But that's where this camera comes in. The Nikon Z5, the original version that got a lot of criticism back in the day, but nowadays is so affordable that you can get two Nikon Z5s for the price of most entry-level full-frame cameras are new nowadays. So let's talk about if this camera is still worth it. My very first DSLR interchangeable lens camera was a Nikon D3200 with the kit 18 to 55 and 55 to 200 millimeter lenses. And I thought that was the greatest thing since sliced bread because previously I'd only ever shot on like the family point and shoot. And this felt like a whole new world. It felt like I was shooting a professional camera. It was using that camera that I truly found my passion for photography and for filmmaking through a high school film class that I was taking. And over time, as I learned more, as I tried to think about maybe taking that leap and trying to be more of a professional photographer, I upgraded to a Nikon D7200. And a little while after that, I upgraded to a Nifty 50. And with that D7200 and the Nifty 50, I felt like I could take on the entire world. I loved that setup so much. I learned how to do things like long exposures and take photos of the night sky on that little D7200. All that to say, I grew up loving my Nikon. I did so much learning and so much growth and discovered my passion for photography while shooting on exclusively Nikon cameras. It wasn't until I started doing more video work that I realized the video capabilities of those particular cameras were just not good enough at the time. And that's when I made the switch over to mirrorless, starting first with a Panasonic G7 and then eventually an A6400. Ever since I switched over to the A6400, I've been a loyal Sony shooter for all of my professional work. But this channel has allowed me to find a reason to shoot a bunch of different cameras. And I'm really kind of excited to be able to shoot on a Nikon again. I have a lot of good memories shooting with Nikon. And if I'm honest, it's been really sad for me to see how much criticism Nikon has gotten as they've entered the mirrorless game and how far behind they've fallen. If you watch other channels similar to mine, people that talk about photography and cameras, you've probably heard some of the criticisms about Nikon's mirrorless cameras. The autofocus isn't as good, the video is kind of lackluster. So the question that I really have about the Nikon Z5 is, after all of that criticism, is this camera still worth it? Is it worth your money nowadays? Or is it something that you should just completely avoid because it's not good enough? So let's talk about that. So let's talk about some specs first. The Nikon Z5 is a 24 megapixel mirrorless full frame sensor with in-body image stabilization up to 5 stops. The ISO can go as low as 50 and as high as 102,400. In terms of autofocus, it uses contrast and phase detect autofocus with 273 autofocus points. And the Nikon Z5 is capable of face and eye detect autofocus, although this is something that we're going to come back to later on. For all of you sports photographers out there, this camera is quite slow in continuous shooting. It can do up to 4.5 frames per second, but interestingly enough, it almost has a virtually unlimited buffer. The only limit you'll really run into is the 100 shot continuous limit, which it'll apply whether you're shooting JPEG or RAW. It can do 4K up to 30 frames per second, but with a pretty severe caveat. It can only do that with a 1.7 crop. That puts the crop factor more aggressive than a APS-C camera and slightly less aggressive than a micro four thirds camera. It also means that this 40mm lens, which on a full frame camera is a pretty normal usable range, suddenly becomes almost a telephoto at 68mm if I want to shoot in 4K. 1080p though can do up to 60 frames per second without a crop. And that's about it. Besides that, there's really nothing else to talk about when it comes to the video. It's pretty plain, in my opinion. But that's not what this camera is focused on. It is focused on taking photos. And that it is really, really good at. Paired with the right lens, it is capable of taking some seriously impressive photos. RAW files are rich in detail and are pretty contrasty and punchy in their colors, and it gives you a lot of room to play with. Now, if you're used to really high resolution cameras like the A7R line or GFX or anything like that, you're probably not going to be very impressed by this camera. But that's kind of not who this camera is for, at least not anymore. Because if you're someone that's jumping up from APS-C or Micro Four Thirds or any other kind of crop sensor, you're gonna find this camera and the images that it takes very, very impressive. And you're gonna notice a big jump. One thing I did notice is that when left to its own devices, when using any kind of automatic metering, it tended to underexpose the images by quite a bit. I would estimate anywhere from half to almost a full stop underexposed. While this preserves a ton of detail in the highlights and gives you a lot of contrast, it can sometimes crush details in the shadows. So my personal preference was to set the exposure compensation somewhere between plus 0.7 to plus 1. And that I found gave me what I liked as an even exposure. The standard color profile is quite nice. It's very rich in contrast and it's got a lot of punchy colors. But all of the other color profiles are just a bit too much, in my opinion, and some of them just aren't done well. So if you are a photo purist, if you want to take excellent, beautiful looking RAW files and edit them yourself in some kind of post-processing, you are going to love this camera. But if you want a quick snap and go film simulation kind of camera and you want to take cool JPEGs right from your camera, this camera is not really going to satisfy that itch for you. Low light performance is passable. It's not excellent, but it's usable at least, in terms of noise at higher ISOs. Where this camera does struggle quite a bit is finding focus in low light situations. So we'll talk more about that later. But when it comes to higher ISOs and noise, you're not really going to see anything super noticeable until you're around ISO 4000. And even then, it's not super distracting. If you go higher than 4000, if you get around 8000, that's where the noise from high ISO starts to become a bit distracting and it starts to make the image almost unusable. Now, let's talk about the build quality a little bit. Now, some of the complaints and criticisms that I hear about their newer mirrorless cameras is that they are kind of big and bulky. They have these big, huge hand grips and big, huge thumb protrusions out the back. They have tons and tons of physical buttons, and so they're not compact and they're not sleek. And I actually think that's a good thing, because this big chunky grip makes the camera really, really easy to hold, and it's really comfortable to use for long periods of time. I can even just hold it with a couple of fingers pretty comfortably with the amount of space that I have. This big thumb protrusion out the back makes it really nice to have a comfortable grip. I don't ever feel like I need a strap to keep this camera secure, and I would even say it's more comfortable than my A7 IV, than any other camera that I've ever shot. In addition to the size, the buttons are actually a good thing. Having physical buttons, especially if you are newer, if you are trying to learn what everything does, having physical buttons is faster than digital menus. And on top of that, for a pretty entry-level camera, you get two very well-placed function buttons right where your middle and ring finger would sit when you are holding the camera. You also get a really nice dedicated delete button. That's all it does is display and delete photos. So it makes for really easy culling on the go. Now, I was kind of concerned that all of these buttons would be really easy to accidentally hit and to accidentally change a setting. But I did actually take this camera on a wedding and I never misclicked a button. I never accidentally changed a setting because they're placed in a really good spot. They're placed in a well thought out layout that does not actually make it very easy for you to accidentally hit them. Even those two function buttons that are right next to your forefingers, it's actually, if you're gripping the camera, it's pretty easy to miss them. Another benefit of being big and bulky is that you get a big battery, which means big, long battery life. I was able to shoot the entire wedding on one singular battery, and I still have battery life left. Like, this is still the same charge from when I shot that wedding. On top of that, you do get an articulating LCD touchscreen, but all it does is kind of pull out and tilt. It does not flip up and it doesn't do anything super fancy. It is nice and bright and responsive though, so you'll find that as a nice convenience. Now, if you're thinking long-term and you want to get into weddings, dual SD card slots are a must. And for the price point that this camera currently sits at, you get dual SD card slots. Even when it was brand new and cost $1,500, dual SD card slots in a $1,500 full-frame mirrorless camera is not a bad deal in the end. But now, at its current price of around $700 in the used market, it is an absolute steal. So that leads us to the final question. Should you buy the Z5 today? See, the real question there isn't so much, is this camera worth it on paper? Because on paper, for those specs alone, this camera is 100% worth it. For $700, full frame, mirrorless, dual slot, sign me up. But is there a good reason for that pretty steep drop in price from when it was new? Does the issues with this camera mean that it's not usable as a true professional camera? So let's talk about some of the issues that I found as I've shot with the Nikon Z5. The first and the biggest issue, in my opinion, is the autofocus. It's slow and it's quite inaccurate at times, especially in continuous shooting. Take these photos of my son, for example. He's on the swing, not going super fast. And holding the Nikon Z5 in front of him and snapping at 4.5 frames per second, the camera missed most of the shots that we took. It was almost like it was completely readjusting the focus point between each shot. It should be trying to simply move from the previous shot's focus distance to finding a new focus distance from that previous reference point. That, in theory, should make it faster. But my experience with the Z5 is that in continuous shooting, it's basically just gonna completely forget the previous photo and think about the next one in a completely different way. And that's gonna cause it to miss if it's trying to keep up with 4.5 frames per second. So that means if you are a sports photographer or someone that shoots anything that moves a good bit, this camera is not going to be good enough. Now, you can work around that focus slowness. Simply put, you have to wait until it finds focus, until you get that little green square that confirms you are actually in focus. You also have to make sure you are using some kind of spot or point focus. You cannot use wider zone focus because left to its own devices, it doesn't do a very good job of finding the subject that you want. It just kind of finds the closest thing to you and focuses on that, which in a lot of scenes is not the subject you actually want to focus on. So if you use those two workarounds, and if you simply have a little bit of patience and wait for the camera to figure out where it's going to be focused, it is a usable professional camera, but maybe not for the fastest and most demanding of situations. The next issue that I had with the Z5 was the size and the weight. It is a heavy camera, which means if you don't have a strap for it, it's going to be pretty exhausting to use for a long time. During that wedding that I shot, I made the mistake of forgetting my camera strap at home, at least for this particular camera. So I had to basically just carry it around all day like this. And while it is a very comfortable camera to hold, after 8 hours, the weight does get to you. And finally, the last issue that I had with it is the video. Simply put, there's too many competitive options out there that can do 4K without having to do as heavy of a crop. Even a light crop I can be okay with. 1.2, 1.3, even 1.5 I can live with. 1.7 is almost a little bit too much. It makes even a wide lens, like a 24mm, a mid-range lens, turning it into a 40mm instead. And that basically means you'd have to use a fisheye lens to get wide-angle shots if you want to shoot video with the Z5. Now, we've already talked about the fact that it's not really a video or hybrid focus camera. It's very much a photo purist's camera. And so if you keep that in mind and you're okay with not shooting video with it, it works perfectly fine. But the minute you need video, you're limited to 1080p or a pretty aggressive crop in if you want to do 4K. All right, so the big question, is it worth it? Should you buy it? Short answer is yes, especially if you are a newer photographer that wants to make the jump from crop sensor to full frame. And you want a camera body that can help you learn and experience full frame, but also can take you into the realm of professional work as well. This camera can do it all for a very affordable price. And it has almost all of the features that a professional really relies on every single shoot. If you're looking for a true professional full frame camera, this is the best bang for your buck that I've seen in many years. Even the most entry-level and basic full frame mirrorless cameras don't offer the professional level features that the Nikon Z5 offers. You are going to have to work around a slightly slower autofocus, and you don't get to shoot super crisp 4K videos, at least not with anything super wide angle. But if you can be okay with those sacrifices, if what you really want is to take photos and you want a camera that can do that incredibly well for very little money, this is it. This is an incredibly good camera for the price. And you know, if you are really concerned about the autofocus performance, you could get the Z5 II that just came out about a month ago. I mean, that actually is a good bit more money, so you do have to think about that, I guess. So that's pretty much it. That is the Nikon Z5 in a nutshell. A camera that I was honestly kind of expecting to dislike and to criticize, but that I wound up falling in love with. So I'd love to know what you guys think. If you have the Nikon Z5, let me know what your experience has been down below. And if you have the newer Z5 II, I'd love to hear about that as well, because I'm kind of curious if that camera is worth it in the entry-level space. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button. If you want to see more photography-related content like this, please hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.